I'd just like to take a moment to welcome everyone here today. And before we begin the official part of the event, I'd like to introduce myself. So I'm Jane Gunn, so I'm Dean of the faculty this year, and it's a delight to be able to have an event with people, real people in person, as well as being joined online, live online. So we're going to try and keep to time, because I know that there's been people that will be, not Zooming in, but webinaring in. So to begin, I'd just like to take a moment to reflect and acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, who are custodians of the land on which we're having this event today. I'd like to acknowledge the elders, past, present and emerging, and in particular the faculty that are Indigenous colleagues within our own faculty, the wider university, and anyone watching online. As we know, the Wurundjeri people have been the custodians of this part of the land for many, many thousands of years, and we pay respects to them all. So it is a great pleasure to be here today for the Priscilla Kincaid Smith Oration. It's even more of a pleasure to be here in person with many of you, and to be joined in particular by some of Priscilla's family. So welcome and being able to come and make time today. It's great to have you with us. This is an annual event. We've been running this since 2015. So it's relatively new, even though Priscilla's impact within our university and wider community is much, much more than that. And you're going to hear a little bit more about her in a moment, so I won't steal Margie's thunder. But this year, it's really a great pleasure to have the oration delivered by Professor Sharon Lewin, who is a wonderful colleague and member of the faculty and university here, and another one of health's trailblazing leaders. And as you know, or maybe some of you don't know, Sharon is now, of course, a household name. So that's even better. The event this year falls just a few days before International Women's Day, and we see this oration as a lead up to that. Obviously, Priscilla Kincaid Smith, being a female clinician researcher and great advocate, really sets the scene for these events. And every year we select a speaker that really has something within their work that really speaks to the work and the role modelling that Priscilla herself engendered in the community. And I think, Sharon, you certainly come up to that task. But before we begin, I'd like to ask Associate Professor Margie Danshan to come and say a few words about Priscilla Kincaid Smith. Margie is a paediatrician within the Royal Children's Hospital, a member of the university community and the Murdoch Children's Research Institute. She runs a magnificent program of research all about vaccination, and that's a topic of the moment. And Margie and Sharon are both going to join me at the end of the oration, and we're going to have a discussion. So Margie, I'd like to allow you to welcome us to the event.
I have to put the microphone up slightly. Okay, thank you, Jane. And it's a pleasure to be here today to celebrate one of the university's global leaders in medicine, Priscilla Kincaid Smith. But first, Jane, I'd like to begin by congratulating you on recently being elected the first woman to be Dean in the faculty's 160-year history. So congratulations to you. You've certainly been a great personal inspiration to me, and we all really look forward to working closely with you in many years to come. So as Jane said, with International Women's Day next Monday, the 8th, today we celebrate the work of a woman who took big strides towards gender equity at a time when the field of medicine was actually very male-dominated. Priscilla was a giant in the field of nephrology and health research, and her career really did pave the way for women in academia across all disciplines. Just a little bit about her. She trained in medical research in Johannesburg and in London before marrying and moving to Melbourne with her Australian husband in the early 1950s. And at that time, believe it or not, married female doctors were prohibited from employment at hospitals and at university, which I really think is quite astounding. Yet, as a female clinician and pathologist, she went on to author over 400 research papers, and she really transformed the global understanding of nephrology and pioneered life-saving interventions in kidney damage. I was also excited to read that she was also a remarkably gifted athlete. She actually held national titles in freestyle swimming, I believe, and was part of the South African women's hockey team and actually trained with the Olympic team. Is that right? Yeah, amazing. But of course, not surprisingly, Priscilla's career was one of many firsts. She was, in fact, the first female professor at the University of Melbourne in 1975, and we've all just had a little round table to verify that fact. She was the first female chair of the Royal Australasian College of Physicians and of the Australian Medical Association, and the first female and first Australian to chair the World Medical Association. So today we celebrate her significant accomplishments that really laid the groundwork for future generations of female medical practitioners and her incredible advocacy, leadership and international impact. So for me personally, I've reflected on my shorter career in light of honouring and celebrating Priscilla today. Interestingly, I too was born in Johannesburg, although 45 years later, so I'm also a South African, and I've tried to combine clinical work, research, university life, patient advocacy and family. I have 4 rambunctious children, a son who's just finished year 12 through COVID, which was a serious challenge, and 3 daughters aged between 11 and 16. But I never had to wrangle twin boys, and we're very fortunate to have Priscilla's daughter here today, which is just terrific. So I've had a very non-linear path with many twists and turns, as it seems Priscilla did, and I've always been very open to serendipity and opportunity. I've never been a national level athlete, but I feel having embarked on the motherhood and career juggle like so many of my colleagues and many of you here today has actually felt like a never-ending marathon. I'd like to share with you a time when this was particularly intense for me, when my husband and I were pursuing fellowships in Canada in 2005. We went to Toronto with 2 small children. Our eldest was 2 and the next one was 6 months. We were in Toronto, it was -20, snow everywhere, and I turned up as the first part-time general paediatric fellow at the Hospital for Sick Children and was told that my roster was 2 full-time weeks on and 2 weeks off. And I can assure you, trying to explain that to 2 little people was very difficult when mum was gone for such long periods of time. Still, I was very grateful to do the fellowship, but it entailed on-call overnight, multiple times per week and every second weekend. So from very early on, my husband and I became interchangeable, and I stopped doing the endless to-do lists and instructions like we were wont to do very early on, and we just became interchangeable, as I said. But obviously we've tweaked things as we've gone along, and we now share pretty much all the household duties and the endless kids' activities and sport. But for me, I just wanted to reflect, and I think obviously for Priscilla as well, having a partner who regards my work as important as his has really made the world of difference to me and my career. Priscilla's advocacy for her patients is also something that I feel really passionate about. Paediatrics has enabled me to advocate strongly for children and families, both as a clinician but also through the media, and in my role as the Director of Clinician Scientist Pathways at the Melbourne Medical School. I'm also passionate about empowering women in academic leadership through mentorship and sponsorship. And I feel that at this stage of my career, it's a real privilege to have the opportunity to lift other women up. And even though at times I may be the first person to walk through some doors, I certainly won't be the last, as Kamala Harris said when she became the first female vice president recently of the USA. So I'd like to leave you with one of my favourite quotes, as the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, "Women belong in all places where decisions are being made." And who better to exemplify that than Sharon, who's really an inspiration to us all. So thanks, and over to you, Sharon.
Thanks very much, Margie, for that wonderful opening. I'm feeling a little nervous. I think it's the first time I've given a talk in front of people for 12 months, actually. I'm so comfortable sitting in my little Zoom zone. Special welcome to Jackie here and Ian. Great to see you both. I'd also like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all meeting, I know we're also virtual, so all the different lands, here being the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and welcome any Indigenous people here today. I'm really delighted and very honoured to be giving the Priscilla Kincaid Smith Oration. You've heard a lot about Priscilla already, but there's no doubt that we're gathering today to remember an extraordinary woman at a pretty momentous time in public health history, certainly for me as an infectious diseases physician and virologist. And also a pretty momentous time of the year, as you've heard earlier, the first week of March and the lead up to International Women's Day. And there's a lot happening on that front right now nationally. For every medical graduate across Melbourne over the last 5 decades, and especially for women of my generation, the aura of Priscilla Kincaid Smith has loomed large. You've heard a lot about her already from Margie, but for me, as a passionate clinician scientist, she was certainly that. She stayed an active clinician throughout her whole career and used astute clinical observations to make countless research contributions. And from analgesic nephropathy to malignant hypertension to reflux nephropathy, quite an extraordinary list of achievements. She also had lots of firsts that you've heard about, but I think we need to put it into context. She was working also against enormous odds, given that up until 1967, women were forced to resign from paid work if they were married, and I believe that happened to Priscilla when she moved here from the UK and had to stop work. So she was an absolute pioneer, she was tough, and she was a fighter. I actually personally never met your mother, nor had the opportunity to work with her, but I know her son Kit very well, who's also an ID physician and a long-standing colleague. He's currently in Tasmania, so I'm going to forgive Kit. He said he's going to watch this online later. But when I spoke to Kit in preparation for today, he glowingly told me a lot about his mother and his view of the reason for his mother's great secret to success. And that was her husband, Ken. I was a little taken back when that insight came from Kit, but then he explained that Ken was an extraordinary man for his generation. He sounds a little bit like Margie's husband, not like my husband. No, my husband's very supportive, but doesn't do all the cooking, cleaning, picking up kids. But apparently, Ken Fairley at that time was quite extraordinary, fully supportive of and not at all threatened by his wife's demanding career and great success. I gather it was a true equal partnership. And I suspect many young mothers in the 60s, let alone in 2021, experienced that. They were very happily married, were best friends in life and in work, had 3 very successful children, Kit and Jackie here. And I understand that Priscilla never fussed too much on the home front. She didn't care too much about what was on the table for dinner or how clean the house was. And I think that's a great lesson for every woman in the room as well. So she certainly seemed to have it all. So many of you who have attended previous orations would actually know a lot about her extraordinary life and career. But I think it's a story worth telling and retelling, so I'm glad that Margie spent some time on it. But today I'm going to focus on something I'd only recently become aware of, and that's Priscilla's history of advocacy for her patients, for her profession, particularly while President of the Royal Australian College of Physicians, and for public health. Amongst many examples, the real inspiration for me was that at a very early time in her career, and I think this is the late 60s, she identified an extraordinary link between the use of analgesics and papillary nephropathy. And actually for the non-Australians in the room, you may not have even heard about this because it was a uniquely Australian phenomenon. But her goal after making that very astute link was not just to treat analgesic nephropathy, but to prevent it. And that would need a complete change in how analgesics were marketed at that time in Australia. and very practically how they were actually packaged. So what we're so familiar with now with bubble packs for individual aspirin was a brilliantly simple way to restrict excessive use of analgesics. And consequently, along with that advocacy, her clear depiction of the link, analgesic nephropathy, which was a really big medical issue in Australia, literally disappeared. So in one interview I read about her, she spoke about this issue making her quite unpopular, but she had absolutely no qualms about not being liked. And to me, that is being part of being an advocate. According to the dictionary, an advocate's a pretty simple definition, a person who works for a cause or a group. And I think for the clinicians in the room, you'll know that all of us are everyday advocates acting in the interests of our patients. And for the scientists in the room, I know they're also often passionate about using their research to make the world a better place. But advocacy on a broader level to the community that's highly visible, and political advocacy needs a whole range of different skills. Foremost among them is outstanding capacity in communication to a diverse group. You need courage, a commitment to extensive collaboration, and hopefully no self-interest. So today I'm going to focus on the unique and distinct challenges and opportunities of being an advocate in the time of a pandemic, something we've all lived through together over the last 12 months. And I want to discuss what for me was a real game changer in advocacy, and that's HIV. So I graduated from medicine at Monash in 1986. I'm sure many people remember that era of Peter Gabriel, Tina Turner, shoulder pads. And if you've been watching It's a Sin, it was a desperately sad time. It's a Sin portrays that really well of young gay men living in London in the early 80s. And if you've been watching it, I can see Shelley nodding in the back, you'll have that music and the dance moods of that era well in your thoughts. But It's a Sin conveys the incredible uncertainty, the stigma and devastation of HIV at that time. At that time, I was a young intern at the Alfred. It was the mid-80s, and the 20th century's most significant pandemic was surprisingly barely visible to me. It was very much in the shadows, so different to what we're experiencing now. But in 1989, I spent a year in Kenya working in a small mission hospital near Nairobi, which was where I really became fascinated by HIV and registered the true global scale of this then new virus. And 2021 actually marks the 40th anniversary. It's a big year for the HIV community. It's the 40th anniversary of the first cases of what was opportunistic infections and new malignancies in young gay men in New York and San Francisco. And at that time, surprisingly invisible to the US government. 4 decades on, as many of you in the room will know, HIV has been transformed from a universal death sentence to a chronic, manageable illness where people living with HIV in nearly every country and continent now have a normal life expectancy, often taking a single tablet a day. 26 million of the 38 million people living with HIV now have access to antiretroviral therapy. That's over 50%. With no vaccine still, we've got highly effective ways to prevent HIV infection through something called pre-exposure prophylaxis or PrEP, taking antivirals that can reduce your chance of infection by 99% if you take the tablets. And just a month ago, the first phase 3 study of women in Africa who received injectable PrEP, so an injection every 2 months, was announced. And the real-world effectiveness of injectable PrEP for women who often had to hide their tablets from their partners is even greater, 89% fewer HIV infections in participants who received an injection compared to taking tablets. As excited I am with those scientific advances, for me the key lesson in HIV was that the advances could never have been made by science alone. It was advocacy. It was advocacy from patients, from the community, from clinicians, from politicians, that changed the face of HIV. Now, contrary to what many here might assume, the HIV patient advocate is no longer a sophisticated white gay man from the inner suburbs of Melbourne, Sydney or San Francisco. The HIV advocate in 2021 is a 16-year-old black woman from a South African township, a transgender sex worker from Mumbai, a person who injects drugs from the Ukraine. I've met all of those advocates, and they each share a remarkable common experience, but now common language through their empowerment and advocacy. All of them across the world have adopted that legacy and model of the advocates from the early 80s that you may be more familiar with. And these advocates of 2021 have been extraordinarily effective in their mission. So in HIV, advocacy has saved over 40 million lives, maybe more. Advocacy has changed everyday care of patients. Advocacy has changed how we do clinical research. The idea of a consumer as part of a protocol team or a grant review panel was unheard of in the 80s, now common in all areas of medicine. Some of you will know that this actually wasn't a very easy path in the tense time of the early 1980s. Senior clinicians and scientists weren't used to the idea of having to justify their research to a patient. Many of them don't like doing it now. I suspect many of you may not know that one of the first clinician advocates, a clinician who really embraced and stood up for this concept, was Tony Fauci, now a household name for COVID-19, though of course has been very active for infectious diseases for a lot longer. At the time, he was a 35-year-old director, I think, of the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. And he was one of the really first to embrace this new way of doing research, a true clinician advocate. Advocacy changed how regulators approve and price drugs globally. The generation of an emergency use authorisation from the FDA, something that you're all hearing about now for COVID treatments and vaccines, had its origins in the emergency use authorisation of the very first antivirals for HIV. Advocacy also changed pricing for HIV drugs in high and low income countries. And this is an extraordinary achievement. HIV drugs cost very different amounts of money in high income countries where drugs are on patent for the first 10 years to cover their costs of development, while in low income countries it's as cheap as $100 a year to now treat someone with HIV. This same model was then used for hepatitis C drugs, and hopefully we will see the same for COVID treatments and vaccines. So as a scientist and clinician who spent my entire career in HIV medicine, I still marvel at the scientific progress. Although interestingly, just in the last 12 months, many members of the HIV community who now see what has been done with COVID and in a startlingly quick time genuinely think we could have done and certainly should do better. With 6 effective vaccines for COVID licensed in just over 12 months, I have to confess that suddenly the scientific advances in HIV feel glacial. And we still don't have a cure or a vaccine for HIV. I remain passionate about the fact that we still need a cure for HIV and optimistic that much of the scientific advances we've seen from COVID will really have an impact on that challenge. So comparing pandemics is never going to be an apples with apples exercise. And so it is with comparing HIV and COVID-19. However, I think it's really instructive to ask what lessons did HIV teach us about where we have been over the last year with COVID and where we are heading, and what should the future of our pandemic response look like. So I remain incredibly proud of what we've achieved in response to COVID in Australia and particularly Melbourne. It's incredible that we're even sitting in a room like this today. But throughout 2020, I'll be honest, I had some real unease about the ways we were doing it. Our success in Australia was a result of strong political leadership informed by science, and that absolutely gets a major tick from me. But it was delivered through top-down rules, fines and punishment for complying. I'm not sure we could have delivered what we have today, essentially elimination of COVID, another way. But the year ahead will be and needs to be different. A successful vaccine program in Australia that we're going to hear a lot about later will need community leadership and empowerment now. This can't be top down from government. Community leaders need to be supported by government, but they need to be our advocates. And this is going to take time, investment, and significant support. The same ethical imperative that allowed for global access to antiviral drugs for HIV is now core to ensuring vaccines can lead us to a normal life. It's amazing to me that the issue of global vaccine access hasn't really been discussed at length in Australia. Everyone seems to be far more concerned about getting the best vaccine for them. Am I going to get the Pfizer vaccine? I deserve the Pfizer vaccine. And this issue is really in need of strong advocacy from every Australian. 80% of the world's COVID vaccines have been acquired by 11 countries. Australia's purchased 120 million vaccines, enough to vaccinate every Australian 3 times over. If we continue down this current path, we're destined for 2 worlds, a world where rich countries vaccinate everyone and update their vaccines with every new variant every year, and poor countries that have no or inadequate vaccine coverage and the virus just keeps circulating and mutating. So never has our global interconnectedness really been so fragile and now so important. Now isn't the time for any kind of nationalism, let alone vaccine nationalism. And as the front page of the New York Times recently stated, if poor countries go unvaccinated, rich ones will pay. Just yesterday at the Doherty, we had a fantastic seminar, one of the great advantages of everything being virtual, from Professor Salim Abdul Karim, South Africa's leading infectious diseases expert. And he quoted Tedros, head of the WHO, who recently said, "The world is on the brink of a catastrophic moral failure. Even as they speak the language of equitable access, some countries and companies continue to prioritise bilateral deals, going around COVAX, that's the central repository for vaccines for low-income countries, driving up prices and attempting to jump to the front of the queue. This is wrong, but yet we still hear Australians asking our government to be doing just that. So as an Australian sitting in a COVID-free world with a very clear guarantee of being vaccinated potentially 3 times over, now is the time for all of us to be advocates and ensure there is true global access to vaccines. As my colleague Slim said yesterday, no one is safe until everyone is safe. Finally, I can't end this oration in honour of Priscilla and in celebration of International Women's Day in 2021 without mentioning 2 inspirational women who have embodied advocacy, courage and activism. Grace Tame, Australian of the Year, and Brittany Higgins have brought their chilling and personal stories of sexual assault to all of us over the last 6 weeks. Unfortunately, they're not lone voices. They've reminded us that despite the great successes so many women have achieved, despite the fact we now have a faculty of medicine full of Priscilla Kincaid Smith phenotypes, we have a very long way to go for women to achieve true equality. And by equality, I just mean feeling safe at school, feeling safe at work, or feeling safe just walking home at night. So whether it's about misogyny or women's rights or analgesic nephropathy, antivirals for HIV or a COVID vaccine in Australia or elsewhere, all of us can and should stand up as advocates for a better, fairer world. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sharon. I think you'll see how much you've hit a nerve with the extent of the round of applause. I would like to invite Margie and Sharon both up to the front. We're going to have a little panel discussion now, and I think we'll even have some time for a couple of questions at the end. But I think that Sharon personifies a woman that has found her voice, and I thank you for that wonderful oration. So I'll just get this. So we just wanted to have a bit of a chat, a fireside chat. We've even got a bit of a fire behind us. And, you know, there's lots of topics that you both covered on, and it's like where to begin. So I might begin just with the starting point of the vaccination program and the thought, you know, that we know there's a little bit of vaccine hesitancy in the community. There's certainly a lot of things being mentioned on social media, etc. And so I might just start with you, Margie, because this, vaccination hesitancy is your favourite topic, and just ask you to share with us your thoughts on, as an academic community, and that's what we bring here today, and the clinical community, what's our role in seeing Australia through this and a global impact that we could have?
Yeah, thanks, Jane. Before I talk about vaccine hesitancy, though, I just want to highlight what Sharon said about access to vaccines and practical barriers, because that is always the biggest cause of under-vaccination. And in fact, the biggest challenge we have is actually more around all of the incredible deployment factors that we're faced in terms of getting these vaccines out into the community through hubs, helping the providers to give them, upload them onto the air. There's many barriers. So it's always really important, I think, to keep the whole vaccine hesitancy, anti-vax situation in context in under-vaccination, because it's not actually the major reason why we might not reach the coverage levels that we want. But when we think about vaccine hesitancy, again, it's really important to realise that vaccine acceptance sits on a spectrum. And, from accepting to those people who have mild or major concerns or cherry pick a few vaccines versus those who are truly refusing. So, and the reason that's important is we have to have different strategies. So for the anti-vaxxers or the true refusers, that's a big conversation. But in terms of the vaccine hesitant people, I think everyone here would say that we all have a right at the moment to ask questions about these vaccines. They have been developed incredibly quickly, and people have questions about the safety and about how well they work in particular. At the moment, we know from lots and lots of ongoing work and polls that the majority of people say they will accept a vaccine. At the moment, it's sitting around about 60% across the population, whereas it was sitting around 80%. So it has dropped about 20%, but still the majority are accepting. But the big bulk, 25% of people are hesitant and they have questions. And I'm sure what we're going to talk about now is how do we address those questions? And really, in a nutshell, that's about community engagement, and about actually trust and communicating with people from very many different communities, Indigenous communities, different ethnic and multicultural communities. And it's not about throwing fact sheets at people and websites. It's actually about true communication. And we can talk a little bit about that in a minute.
Thanks, Margie. Sharon, one of the things that we were talking about before we started and what we might talk about on the panel around, this issue of public communication and the fact that, you have become a household name during 2020, is that there is a power of potential power within the media, but there's other ways of making change. And I know you've got some interesting thoughts on that. And would you like to share, just bouncing from what Margie's saying on, how should we go about getting the community fully informed?
Well, I think picking up a bit what Margie is saying and what I was saying in the oration is that you need, for public health generally, you need engagement of people affected by it. It's a little bit of a challenge in Australia because we're living such normal lives now. So people almost think, COVID, COVID's not really affecting them day to day. So it's a bit of a challenge. But I think, and community engagement people need a lot of information, understanding and education. And so I actually think the media has done an extraordinarily good job over COVID. People's literacy over quite complex issues, the fact that my mother knows what an mRNA vaccine is and has a view, I think is fantastic. I do think it's fantastic. And I think that, that was like niche science, 12 months ago. Actually, I was on a talkback show the other day and someone said, can you tell me, rang in and with Raf Epstein and said, what do you think about a DNA vaccine? And the first thing Raf said was, there is no DNA vaccine. I said, well, actually, there is a DNA vaccine. People know these incredibly. I think it's great for science. So I think the more information, but it has to be done in accessible ways, and different communities will take that information in different ways. And I think for us as experts or experienced clinicians or scientists, or the more we can talk about what we do and explain and make it accessible, the better is my view.
So one of the things that Margie mentioned was the speed with which the vaccines have been developed, and you touched on that in your talk as well. From the Australian public point of view, do you think there should be concern that the speed of development in some way is an issue they should be concerned about?
There's absolutely no concern to me about corners being cut. The speed of vaccine development is twofold. The first, it comes off decades of investment in science. We only know about RNA vaccines and vector vaccines because of investment in work for HIV, Ebola, influenza. So this has come off. In fact, the first Mrna vaccine, they got it right because of all the work that had been done on MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. So it comes off decades of science. But then the process of going from the lab into a product was very quick because all of the steps along the way were overlapped instead of sequential. And if you overlap those steps, you have to put a bit more money in up front, but we were in a crisis and that was what was done. So in fact, there's been no corners cut at all. But there are unknowns because we've got 2 vaccines at the moment that have never been used at scale as we are seeing now, which is the mRNA vaccine and the AstraZeneca viral vector vaccine. But now that we've also rolled it out so quickly, we're not seeing any unusual adverse events at very low frequency, which you can only identify once you've put the vaccine to millions of people. So it has been a remarkable story of scientific success. And I guess, I really have been reflecting on this idea, was like, wow, 40 years of HIV and we don't even have a vaccine that works. Much harder virus, but it just shows you what you can achieve with money and commitment. We can't do that for everything, of course, but it is incredible.
You mentioned that you thought there would be some things that were going to go from COVID work to influence other areas because of the amount of investment and effort that people have put in. Where do you think the biggest gains will be made?
Vaccination science will be just irreversibly changed. So people have been, RNA vaccines started about 10 years ago. Novartis had a program with them. There's been some small phase 2 studies for flu, HIV, and Zika, I think. And it would have just taken forever to get these in. The big breakthrough for RNA was the packaging, putting it inside a fat bubble to allow it to stay intact. And there'll be developments on those. I know now of work on RNA vaccines for malaria, for dengue, for HIV. It will just transform it. The other really interesting area that we haven't talked about much in Australia is antibodies. And so normally for most viruses we treat with small molecule antiviral drugs. All antiviral drugs, is very hard to shortcut them because they're new molecules and you have to test for safety. But you can also use antibodies, just like you hear about antibodies to protect you from infection, antibodies can be used essentially as antiviral drugs. Again, a lot of work was done on this for HIV. And they can be made really quickly. And the first antibodies for COVID were made in around June of this year, and they're now licensed as actually antiviral drugs. I don't think they're going to work that well personally in COVID, but it's a much quicker pathway to get an antiviral than a small molecule. Antibodies are really going to be really important as an HIV treatment and prevention. They're going to be important for new viruses, because if a new virus comes along, you can make something like this very, very quickly. So those two areas will have big impact. And the third area is diagnostics. So we've seen people diagnostics at scale, the capacity to do sort of PCR tests or the nasal swab, not only across Australia, in every part of Australia, but across, in low and middle income countries, will be a fabulous capacity for diagnosing infectious diseases going further. So there's going to be some really very important scientific outcomes.
To just to finish up the session really is to get your thoughts on whether we're doing enough to support female clinician scientists.
Maybe I can speak to that, an area very close to my heart. So I think, we have such extraordinary women leaders in our precinct, and women are definitely flourishing more than ever before. But I think there are still significant barriers that women face. And I mentioned earlier, I particularly think sponsorship has a key role to play for women clinician scientists coming through, in terms of, particularly if they're at points in their career where they're part-time and they have young children, having that leg up from senior people to give them a seat at the table, because, they have a voice, they're eminently able, but they're not always there, they're not full-time. So, I think the power of sponsorship to really galvanise careers is critical, whether it's a conference plenary or a committee position, or so. I think that's just one thing I think really can move, shift the dial for women. But there are lots of other things that I think we can think about, and I'm sure Sharon can sort of add to that. But I do think we need to constantly be thinking about how we can promote our women leaders, and really take into account the great diversity and all of the barriers that they're facing, just continue to push them forward.
Yeah, I wonder a bit whether COVID is going to help things. Over the last 12 months, lots of us have seen, seen into each other's lives. It's very hard to hide your personal life on Zoom, unless you have some people that always have the fake background on. But, suddenly you see everyone's juggling things, men and women. And I think women have tried to hide that.
Although I do think there have been a lot of women academics that have struggled enormously with COVID, with young children at home. I mean, my heart just goes out to people with young, either toddlers or primary school age children, and how they're managing Zoom meetings and keeping their life going with little people in the background, or trying to manage homeschooling. So I think COVID has disproportionately affected women, even though it has impacted men as well.
Oh, absolutely. But it's just raised that awareness of we all have lives outside of work, and you don't need to hide them. And I think women have found that hard, and probably men find that hard too. Definitely. But it's brought it all forward, and I think
it started a bigger conversation, I think, which is really healthy. And I also think never before have men and women appreciated teachers so much, having to try and teach your own children at home. So you're right, I think it has shifted the dial, it's changed the conversation, but I do think we've still got a long way to go to really support women.
A long way to go, and I think that the flexible, adaptable kind of work that women have experienced during COVID is the bit they liked, putting the homeschooling together as if they have to come together. Well, if you've got flexibility, you have to have homeschooling as well. You can have schools open and flexibility at work. So I think that really is the way forward. Look, I think, we've covered many, many topics today, including the current topic of real national shame, I think, again, with sexual harassment and things coming to the fore. And so it's going to be a very difficult time for many women over the coming weeks as all of that plays out. And I'm sure, none of our communities are immune from that. And one of the things that certainly holds women back in terms of being able to achieve their best is just feeling safe, as you said, Sharon. So I think that that's a really important part of the message today as well. I'd like to really thank all of you for joining us. This is the end of the formal session, so a particular thank you to those who've logged in online. I hope you found it an interesting event to attend. For those of you who are here in person, we will be going downstairs and we have some refreshments, and we hope that there can be some networking and meeting some people you haven't seen for a while. But I'd like to, in particular, give a special thanks to Margie, who did the introduction and put the effort into that. So thank you very much for your work, Margie. And also to Sharon, I think, for just being such a trailblazer during all of your career, but the impact that you've had leading the Doherty Institute, really out there, really contributing such depth of scientific discovery and thought to the debate. And I think that that's just made such a mark on the community, not just here but globally. And I know that there's many colleagues you have that support you in that, but it's just wonderful to see such a fabulous clinician, researcher, woman leading such a magnificent enterprise, which we share with the Royal Melbourne Hospital, of course, and the university, and it's just wonderful. So wishing you all the best. Thanks for giving the oration, and we'll just keep watching what you do with great interest, Sharon. So thanks very much.